This lesson is having a little bit of a think about diseases, in particular the infectious diseases, and why they went and included these certain 6 diseases in your syllabus that they did. Because of course, nothing is done by chance. There's a reason, there's something to be learned from each of those diseases. So let's just start by having a sort of overview of what is a disease. Okay, so a disease, my word, it's such a broad definition. So we'll stick with the one from the course of an illness or disorder of body or mind that leads to poor health. Okay. Each disease is associated with a set of signs and symptoms. So, as I said, this is really broad. There's so much variation within the sort of term disease that it is hard to pin it down to something specific. We can break it down into 2 categories, looking at our non-infectious and our infectious diseases. So if we think about non-infectious, we don't sort of study them explicitly in AS biology, but they do crop up. Okay, so these ones are non-infectious, are not caused by pathogens. Whereas infectious are caused by pathogens. Okay, so for example, our non-infectious diseases that we come across, things like lung cancer. So this is an example of a long-term degenerative disease. We also come across in our syllabus sickle cell. So sickle cell anemia. That is a genetic disease, an inherited disease. And when we talk about immunity and we talk about immune system, it's also, we touch on kwashiorkor, which you also do at IG. Now the thing about this one, this is a deficiency disease. And here we have that problem of, okay, if we have kwashiorkor, then we have too little protein. If we have too little protein in our diet, we can't then build things out of protein. And if we can't build things out of protein, we can't build antibodies. But that is a whole entire another lesson. So we're not going to get into that today. Today we're going to focus on these infectious diseases, the 6 infectious diseases, and what's their story. So the thing also to remember here, okay, caused by pathogens, and pathogens are passed from an infected individual to a non-infected individual. Okay, so it's really important that that's how we then transmit our disease. So what are the 6 that we're talking about? Well, you've got 2 bacterials. So bacterial pathogens, we look at cholera and we look at TB. You have 1 eukaryotic pathogen. Okay, that is your malaria. And then there are actually the 3 caused by a viral pathogen. So that is your HIV/AIDS, your measles, and your smallpox. So the aim of this lesson is to go through each of those 6 diseases and have a bit of a consideration about why did they choose to include this disease? What is this disease teaching me? The unique the unique points of this disease that helps me understand diseases at a broader scale, that ties in with other elements of my syllabus and with other diseases. So yes, you do have to go and learn the name of the pathogens and the modes of transmissions and all the sort of nitty-gritty details for each of these diseases. But it's also one of those topics where you need a higher level understanding. And if you take the time to think about and to understand why each of these diseases was included, then you're sort of prepping yourself up for those questions that they're leading you into, where we're thinking a little bit beyond the fact of it is caused by, it is transmitted by, and actually understanding what's going on in the system. So let us continue. We're going to start off with cholera. So we'll start off with our bacterial diseases. What does cholera have to teach us? Okay, so first off, it's an example of a bacterial pathogen. Okay, but there's something a little bit unique about cholera. Okay, cholera is within the small intestine, so within a lumen of the small intestine. It's not actually technically inside the body, it's not inside the tissues. Okay, so that is quite special. Cholera is not in the body's tissues. Why is this important? Because if you're not in the tissues, you're not exposed to the immune system. Okay, so it is actually safe from the immune system. And this is why treatment for cholera is all about symptomatic relief. It's about relief of that dehydration, for example. Okay, because we can't fight this with an immune system. And all of those lines of defenses that we talk about when it comes to immune system and recognizing antigens and preparing antibodies and all of those sorts of things, it's not coming into play because the cholera is not actually in the tissues. Okay, on the sort of other side of it, so that's a sort of biological reason why cholera is in here, because it's a unique disease in terms of interaction with the immune system. The other one is that the massive impact of socioeconomic implications on cholera. So the importance of sanitation. There's nothing demonstrating this quite in the same way as cholera does. So that, and combined with a socio-economic, if you could spell economic, economic impact. So often when you hear about your natural disasters and hurricanes and mudslides, and then people being losing their homes and going into camps, and then you get a cholera outbreak, and it's often linked to this impact of lack of sanitation and how do you do disaster relief and manage an outbreak as well. Okay, so there's a little terminology that comes in here that's quite nice as well. We're going to keep track of these. So in the course there's a whole lesson just on terminology and making sure you get straight. And here, the one that cholera really brings home is epidemic. So an epidemic is very simply a sudden increase in the number of people which have the disease. So we're putting our vocabulary institute in this lesson. Okay, so cholera is bacterial, but it is essentially safe from the immune system because it's not in the tissues. And it really drives home the importance of sanitation and the implications of socioeconomic impact. With a lack of funding, with a lack of infrastructure, it's really hard to fight a cholera outbreak. You get an epidemic of cholera. Whereas in your more developed countries and where you don't have your natural disasters happening, then cholera is at a much lower frequency. So our other bacterial pathogen is TB, so tuberculosis. Let's give him his full name, tuberculosis. Also, a bacterial pathogen. Here, something different though, okay? What is special about TB? Why include this bacterial pathogen? Well, you also study antibiotics as part of your AS syllabus, and tuberculosis is your wonderful classic example of a problem with antibiotic resistance. So the TB bacterium has evolved resistance to antibiotics, and then how do you treat it? What do you do when you have antibiotic resistance? So you need to go back and need to have a look again at that antibiotic lesson when you're looking at TB, because the two of them are sort of a very nice linked together session. Okay, the other thing about TB is it is a classic opportunistic infection. So when a person has HIV and their immune system is compromised, TB is often one of those first site infections where it comes back, or it flares up, or it becomes obvious. Okay, so it's not necessarily, it's linked in with that HIV, and it's an opportunistic infection. It takes that opportunity of flaring up. And then you've got the problem. You've got a degraded immune system, and you've got antibiotic resistance, and you're left with a mess. And we're building this in again also with socioeconomic, and this sort of theme of the bacterial pathogens and the socioeconomic impact is quite tight between both of these diseases. So TB is actually on the increase at the moment, and it is because of movement of people, socioeconomic, economic just doesn't seem to work today. Economic issues and that antibiotic resistance. So we talked about lack of sanitation being a socioeconomic issue for cholera. For tuberculosis, it's really about overcrowding, because now you've got transmission person to person and the coughing. Okay, so when people are living in crowded conditions, then you have a much higher chance of transmission. So you're always linking these things back. So having a good understanding of what's my pathogen and how is it transmitted is then really critical to understanding how does this sort of link into something socioeconomic. So something like sanitation is not necessarily going to increase our TB, because it's a whole different way that we passing something on. But overcrowding is going to be a problem both for TB and for cholera. Okay, so start to pull those things out and pull out your similarities, pull out your differences as you're working through all of the disease in detail. Any queries about our bacterial pathogens? Okay, let us have a look at our one and only unique eukaryotic pathogen. So that would be malaria. So malaria is a eukaryotic pathogen, which is completely different to everything else. So obviously, there's its unique selling point. It is the only one we study, which is a eukaryotic pathogen. Now, what does that mean? How does that cause a problem in life? And it's all about those antigens. Remember, we said that the immune system is recognizing antigens, and that's saying, you know, you're foreign. I'm going to identify you. I'm going to fight you. You're the one that's a problem. So when we have a eukaryotic pathogen, we can have varied antigens. We have more complexity within the DNA, and therefore more complexity in the proteins that are produced. So more complexity in antigens on the cell membrane. What does it mean if we have varied antigens? Okay, so our immune system is going to find it hard, but Also, if we want to develop a vaccine for this, it's going to be like a mission, because you're vaccinating against what? There's too much variation. So varied antigens also implies that then vaccine development is difficult. So in here, we've just talked about how we have more variation, so we have more varied antigens. We also have, on top of that, just causing even more of a problem, we have stages of life cycle. So we don't even have one pathogen that stays the same the whole time it's within the human body. Like a bacteria is a bacteria. It enters, it lives, it leaves. It's the same bacteria the whole way through. Here, we've got different stages of the life cycle happening, and some of those are actually inside the body cells. So now we're worse than inside the tissues, but actually inside the cells. How are we going to find them? Okay, so we've talked about different ways that the body can recognize if there's a problem inside a cell. But if something slides in there and hides away nicely, then we have a problem. So the whole idea of how the body fights malaria, how we can develop vaccines to get rid of malaria, is also very complicated, because the pathogen that we're dealing with is complicated. So the more complicated the pathogen, the more difficult it is to fight, which kind of makes sense. It's a rather logical conclusion. And that is why malaria is now included, is because it is so complicated. It's such a complex disease to deal with, because it is such a complex pathogen. On the upside, it's not all bad, it's not all sad for malaria. Malaria is a very nice example, because you've probably heard in your sort of general knowledge and understanding that there's a lot of fighting of malaria that's done by fighting the mosquitoes rather than the pathogen itself. Because remember, you've got an aspect of your malaria parasite life cycle that's happening within the mosquito. So if you can wipe out that mosquito, that vector, then we can't transmit the disease. So it's a really fantastic example of how you can break transmission by removing the vector. If you prefer the doom and gloom side of the story, then you could sort of flip side this over and say, okay, well, with climate change, increasing temperatures, changing patterns in rainfall, we're going to increase the range of the Anopheles mosquito that's carrying the malaria. And in that way, we can actually spread malaria. And so we've got a flip side to every coin. That's how life works. But in terms of transmission and understanding the transmission of diseases, when we have a vector involved, then it's a whole different game, and we have that opportunity of working against the vector rather than against the pathogen itself. So just adding in a little bit more vocabulary here, we've got two words. One, the vector that we've just been talking about. Okay, so what is a vector? It is simply an organism that transmits an infectious disease. Okay, the other thing to keep in mind here is this idea of a transmission cycle. So what is a transmission cycle? It is very simply how the pathogen passes from one host to another. So we've got wonderful application here, an understanding of our vocabulary, because we're breaking this transmission cycle if we remove the vector, because the vector is the organism that's transmitting the infectious disease. So if the pathogen can't get from one human to another human, then we can't spread that malaria. So if we target that mosquito, then that gives us that option. So malaria is our one and only example of a eukaryotic pathogen, which leads to all sorts of problems with combating the disease because of the variation. However, we have this opportunity where we can break the transmission using the vector. Let's move on then to our last three, which are all viral. So there's some fun and games going on in there as well. So first viral, let's have a look at HIV/AIDS. Why is HIV/AIDS included in your syllabus? Okay, so again, we have a viral pathogen, right? So we're not bacterial, we're not eukaryotic, now we're looking at a virus. Okay, in contrast to malaria, malaria had a vector. HIV/AIDS, we have no vector, it's direct exchange only. And this is like direct to the point of the virus cannot survive outside the human body. Okay, so that's okay, that makes sense. It's a nice contrast to malaria. But now something unique about HIV/AIDS, because we're looking for why would they include this? And the big one here is that HIV/AIDS is a prime example of a disease where you have carriers. And that is because we've got a long time between initial infection and showing symptoms. So we have a very extended time before symptoms appear. And this makes it so difficult because people can be infected and not know and pass on the infection, and nobody knows, and this infection spreads silently through a population group. And that is then, how do you fight something that you can't see? So that's why there's so many drives of get your HIV status, know your status, is because then we have a way of seeing this. Okay, HIV/AIDS is two sort of knock-on problems if we're linking it back to socioeconomic issues. We have a public health problem. Because remember, we said TB is an opportunistic infection that links into AIDS or HIV. So we have a public health issue of we have an increase in these opportunistic infections. Things that shouldn't usually cause a problem are going to be increasing and causing more of a problem. We also have a major socioeconomic issue. Let's see if we can get it right this time. Economic issue. Because of the age range, which is the most affected by HIV/AIDS. And it's that age group of the 20s to 30s. So you've got, where's your workforce? You're left with old people and young people. And that is not a way to build an economy or to grow an economy. It's you've lost your workforce when you're losing people to HIV/AIDS. So we have an age group of the 20s to 30s. And of course, you also got the cost of treatment. We're treating HIV/AIDS through drugs, and those drugs cost money. And it's expensive drugs that are used for HIV/AIDS, and the government is bearing a lot of the cost of this often. So we've got a massive impact on economic development, economic growth of a country, or even of an area, and from a disease that we can't even see. So there's a real issue going on here that is difficult to manage and difficult to work on. So that's why there's a lot of public awareness. So this is one of your big public awareness diseases in terms of being aware of your status and in being aware of the stigma attached and working towards acceptability to know your status and how that could sort of work at a community level to work towards understanding and reducing the impact of HIV/AIDS within a population. So if we add in now to our vocabulary, we talked quickly about carriers here. Okay, so here there's a carrier is a person who has a disease but doesn't show symptoms. So quite important when we're considering the spread of a disease would be carriers. And then mortality, the death rate from a disease. So one more viral infection to fit in here. So I see I also have to watch the time very carefully. So measles, okay? Also viral pathogen. The thing about measles is that it is a highly contagious virus. Okay, the big one here is all about herd immunity. So if you can get herd immunity, then you can fight a disease, and because what you're doing is you're protecting enough of the population that the disease can't spread. So we break the transmission. See where we're going. So the problem with measles is that our vaccination is not very good. You have to have a booster. You only have 95% coverage. And that means that you'd have to cover everybody. You'd have to have 100% vaccination in order to get a high enough vaccination success rate, effectiveness, that's the word. Okay, so vaccinate full population to achieve 90% effectiveness. So vaccines are all very well and good, but when you have a vaccine like the measles vaccine that needs a booster, then it's hindering our process of eradication. We shall keep going in the hope that we don't get kicked out before we finish up. Okay, so we need a booster. We have a low effectiveness or a vaccine. So we're linking measles into where vaccines are problematic. Your terminology here would, of course, be herd immunity. Okay, and this is indirect protection by prevention of transmission. So we're breaking that transmission cycle. So measles is an example of where a vaccine didn't really work. So have a look back again at the vaccine lessons as well when you're looking at measles. And you have to do that in conjunction with the very last one, which of course is smallpox, because smallpox is your example of a wonderful vaccine. Because smallpox is that virus that has been eradicated since 1980. So obviously, unique selling point of smallpox when it comes to your syllabus is that we have actually had a successful vaccination program that has resulted in the eradication of the disease. So there are various different, actually a long list of reasons why that smallpox vaccination program was successful. Okay, things like the vaccine was, it was a stable virus, so the one vaccine was needed, it was cheap to produce in bulk, it was easy to spot people who were infected, and then also easy to administer their vaccine. So all of these sorts of things contribute to the success of a program. So just a couple of things here. Contact tracing, which is also something that we do when we're looking at HIV/AIDS. Identification and diagnosis of people who've been in contact with the infected person, then you quickly vaccinate them. So you are working to treat people in a network. So identification and diagnosis of people who have been in contact with the infected person. So linked to that whole idea of know your status for HIV/AIDS, this can help us build a network of infected people, or potentially infected people. So then your other one here is ring vaccination. So this is a really targeted approach with vaccination, where you vaccinate the household and the surrounding households. So again, you break that transmission cycle. So with seconds to spare, that is now a very brief, getting briefer towards the end, overview of why each of these diseases is included in your syllabus. So it's important to keep this in mind as you work through each disease in detail, that you're feeding into this overarching understanding rather than just learning the basic sort of features of each disease.